Hi, I'm James, and in today's video we're taking a look at this, which is an HP 14CK laptop which has suffered a failure of the hinge mounting point. Now, to deal with this, we are going to have to completely disassemble the laptop and replace the Palmrest assembly. So this is the Palmrest keyboard and touchpad, as these are what holds the hinge to the main section of the machine, and then the base comes to it. So to start off with, we are going to need to begin disassembling the machine, and our first order of business is to remove both of these rubber feet on the base. That is because underneath these there are some hidden screws, 3 at the back and 1 at the front, and then a further 2 screws on the angled section at the front of the chassis. So we're just going to fast forward through this quickly. And so with all the screws removed from the base, our next order of business is to begin removing the base of the laptop. So we are going to spin the laptop around and take a small plastic pry tool, and then we are just going to begin finding a spot here. So actually worked out the easiest section to get it in initially was down this side, then work our way around the front and really you just want to press down and into the gap between the palm rest and the base panel, and using this plastic tool so that you don't mark it, working the whole way round, not using excessive force, just enough to sort of gently push the base out from the palm rest and detach it. Once we've done that on the 3 sides, we can then turn the laptop back over and lift from the front, which will detach the base. Before we go any further, we then want to remove the battery from the system. This is held in with 4 screws, 2 at the front and 2 at the back. And we'll just quickly remove those. And with that done, we're then able to just lift the battery out of place, disconnecting it from the main board as we do so. Our next job is then to remove the wireless card. A single screw holds this, and this particular model only had a single aerial lead, so we just detach that and pull the card clear. We then need to remove the small ribbon cable. So levering from the front to open up the connector and then pulling the cable free before removing the 2 screws for the I/O board. With these removed, we then need to open up the hinge, as the I/O board is also held down with that. So we are going to remove the 2 screws into the hinge at the back. These are a little out of focus in this shot, unfortunately due to the depth of field, but you can see the screws there in the hinge. And then we simply want to use our pry tool to help just lever open and then pull open that hinge to release the I/O board. A little stiff this, but easily enough doable. So there we can see we can then remove our I/O board and unthread the Wi-Fi antenna cable. We now want to turn our attention to the other hinge, where we have 3 cables to disconnect. So we're going to start by lifting this little latch here, and then also removing the DC jack connector. So we can pull that clear. That then sits underneath the DisplayPort connector, so we're going to pull that out. Unwire that from under the little cable clip. And then also just gently pull to unplug the speakers. With that done, again, we need to remove the 2 screws for the hinge. That top one there is where the hinge has actually failed, so was just spinning, so we will deal with that in a moment. We were able to do the bottom one by just pressing down, and that was able to get enough grip onto the plastic to release the screw, but the top one would not. And then again, we want to use a combination of fingers and pry tool just to try and pull open that hinge. And from here, with the hinge open, we just get our screw extracting pliers onto the end of that failed lug and remove the screw from it. Our next job then is simply to slide the base of the laptop out and remove the screen from the laptop. We can then set our 2 panels side by side, so on the right we have our replacement palm rest and on the left the original, which has the damaged mounting for the hinge. And the first thing I'm going to do is transfer across the board and connectors for the touchpad. So the touchpad is included in the main palm rest assembly. However, these pieces need to be transferred across. So we disconnect the touchpad to mainboard connector and also the touchpad to touch button connector. Remove this little bracket and then the screw on the other side. And with that done, we can lift out the little board for the touchpad and fit it into the new keyboard palm rest assembly. Next, we then need to refit the screw on one side and the bracket and screw on the other. Having done that, we can then connect the first of the ribbon cables back into the new touchpad. Before transferring across the little foam pad, which we're going to just lift with a small pry tool and then pull off. And then, having fixed that in, the last thing we need to transfer for the touchpad is the small earthing strip which runs between the chassis and the touchpad itself. A little surprised this didn't come as part of the assembly, but an easy bit of tape to transfer across or replace with some copper tape. Next, we can remove the 2 speakers from the old chassis. These are not adhered or screwed down in any way and just lift out as they just press into place. And then, having done this, we're going to remove the DC jack. Again, this is not stuck or screwed into place. It would normally be held down by the chassis and the hinge, and just press this in before going around and removing the various screws from the main board. It makes sense to keep these in sort of the arrangement that you remove them in, as there are a few different ones, and there was a little bit of exploration here, so I take them out in a slightly odd order. Removing the fan is necessary, so we remove the 2 screws from that. Now, I believe as well it is possible to remove the fan without removing the heatsink at the same time, but in this case I don't do that. we have the little battery connector there to move across. We need to make sure that we unplug the keyboard from the main board. The DIMM module needs to be removed, as there is a mainboard screw underneath that. We then also need to remove the fan, as there is a screw also obscured by that. So disconnecting the fan here. Removing the heatsink, as while we're doing all of this it makes sense to repaste the heatsink, and also it makes removing the fan a little easier. So 4 screws to remove the heatsink, and then simply lifts off. And with those taken out, we can lift off the heatsink and remove the fan. Putting aside to refit later. There we can then see we have the final mainboard screw underneath that corner of the fan. With that done, we can then remove the mainboard from the old chassis and transplant it into place in the new one. With that then lined up, we can refit the screws to hold the mainboard in place. Refit the small bracket for the battery and press back into place the speakers. With that done, we're then going to turn our attention to cleaning up the processor and renewing the thermal paste. So here we just use a little IPA and some blue roll just to wipe the old thermal paste off of the processor, and then put a small dab of fresh thermal compound onto each of the 2 chips. The small one being the chipset effectively. We are then going to do the same with the heatsink pad. But with this, we obviously are not going to replace the thermal paste. We simply press that down into the cleaned up and repasted processor before refitting the 4 screws. We can then reinstall the fan, having cleaned it and just checked for any dust in the heatsink before refitting, and reinstall the 2 screws holding it in place. And of course, ensuring that we remember to reconnect the fan cable to the mainboard, because there is nothing more frustrating than turning on the laptop and it telling you you haven't plugged in the fan. We also need to plug the touchpad into the mainboard, and you can see here I actually trapped the keyboard connector under the mainboard and I fitted it, so I had to just lift the mainboard slightly and then reconnect the keyboard and reinsert our memory module. With that done, we are then going to position the screen back underneath and slide it back into place on top of it. We can then turn our attention to the top corner, and we are going to start by routing our Wi-Fi antenna cable through the little clips to hold it in place. making sure that it is not going to get pinched by the hinge. With that done, we can then slot in the I/O board. Again, making sure the antenna cable is following the right path. And reinstall the 2 screws to hold it in place. With those fitted, we can then align this corner of the chassis and close the hinge, and refit the 2 internal hinge screws. The 3rd screw here is actually the one that goes through the base of the laptop and pins everything together. With that done, we then need to refit the small ribbon cable to the I/O board. Reinstall our wireless card. And reconnect the antenna. Turning our attention now to the other hinge, and what we want to do is make sure our power cable, so the DC jack, is routed under this metal clip, and connect that, pressing it firmly into place. We can then open the DisplayPort latch and insert the cable for that, before pressing the cable to make sure it is out the way of the hinge. This takes a little bit of fiddling, and it is a very important cable, so definitely don't crush it. And then again, aligning the corner of the laptop and shutting the hinge. You may find you need to press the system in a bit towards the screen and then press down the hinge into place. Again, we can then refit our 2 internal hinge screws. And make sure the speaker cable is properly connected. With that all done, we can then refit our battery, pressing it into place to connect it to the main board, and refitting the 4 screws. Into the final stretch now, and we want to replace the base onto the system. This is a good time to flick the system over, power it up, and check that everything is working correctly, so that you don't find you then have to remove all the screws again, having refitted them. But we are going to say that we are happy with the system here, having checked it, and simply refit the base screws, and we should be done and ready to go. So I hope you found this video helpful. This isn't one of the quicker jobs, as you obviously are transplanting basically the whole machine onto the new Palmrest, but not an overly difficult job, so long as you are methodical and thorough in your workings and just keep track of what goes where. So I hope you found this video useful. Do hit like if you have. Any questions, ask them in the comments below, and hit subscribe if you'd like to see more videos as we post them. Thanks for watching.